Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Grace Estrada, and today we're going to cover Chapter 7, Survey Research. So first of all, here are a few objectives. We're going to talk about what exactly is survey research, discuss reasons for using it, identify cognitive processes involved, explain how to develop effective survey questions, outline survey formats, consider ways to administer surveys, distinguish from two types of sampling methods. Those are probability and non-probability. And finally, analyze different types of validity and survey research. So before we even get started, let's remind ourselves about different types of variables because they do make a difference in terms of the data that we collect and analyze. Remember that there are four types of data: nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So nominal and ordinal variable types are considered qualitative, meaning there is no numerical value to them. Remember, nominal variables are distinct categories, so they're just different from each other. We're not saying one is better than the other. We're just saying that they're different. On the other hand, ordinal categories have a rank order. So here we are actually saying that one is better than the other, but the difference between first and second place may not be the same as, for example, second and third place. So it's important to make that distinction. So nominal categories are different, ordinal categories are different, and they are ranked. The two types of quantitative variables are interval and ratio. So with interval ratios, they are different, just like nominal. They're ranked like ordinal, but now you have specific and predictable differences between one ranking and the second. So that's what we mean by meaningful distances. We are assuming that the differences between 1 and 2 are the same as 2 and 3. However, with interval scale variables, there is no meaningful zero. So zero does not mean that there's an absence of that variable. An example of this would be temperature, where 0 degrees does not mean that there's no temperature. Finally, we have ratio scale variables, which are the type that we're most familiar with, which are different like nominal, ranked like ordinal, have meaningful distances like interval, but now we have what we call an absolute zero, where if you say, I have 0 books, it means I really don't have any books. So the 0 in ratio scale variables is meaningful. Now, considering that, when you ask questions, right, you need to think about, am I collecting quantitative data or qualitative data? So again, categorical variables, which are the nominal and ordinal, they don't have any numerical properties. You can't do any calculations on them. You just know that they're different. Continuous variables, on the other hand, have values that are quantitatively different. There is a numerical value to them, and so you can do some calculations. So obviously, if you're collecting nominal or ordinal data, you're very limited to the type of calculations you can do with that data. So in terms of survey research as a design, let's think about what that means. First of all, it's a self-report measure. We are counting on people to let us know what they're thinking, how they're feeling based on the questions that they have. You can use questionnaires. You can also use interviews. So what do we use it for? Sometimes we want to ask people, what are their attitudes towards specific topics? Maybe it's something very straightforward, like demographic information, such as their age, ethnic group, their gender identification. It could be something about how they are feeling that day. It could even be asking questions about physical characteristics. With survey research, it's completely non-experimental. We are not trying to in any way manipulate an independent variable. So we really have to have really good sampling and sampling methods and samples. Because for survey research, we're really counting on external validity. Internal validity is going to be quite low in the sense that there's no manipulation. We will be looking for covariation, and there isn't any random assignment. So the sampling component is really important. Why do we use surveys given that sampling method, the internal validity is not very high? Well, First of all, it's a great way to get just a snapshot of how people are feeling or thinking at a certain point in time. Again, this is self-report, right? But generally speaking, most people are going to be honest about what they're writing. It's a great way to get a lot of data in a short period of time, so you can get correlations and associations between many different types of variables, not just two. Because they're so easy to distribute nowadays, usually is online, it's very easy to get a large amount of data in a very short period of time. So it's a super cost-effective way to actually conduct research. And oftentimes, surveys are used in conjunction with other research methods. So for example, even if somebody were doing an experiment, they might have a brief survey for the participants to take that gives them, an idea of, what are the demographic variables involved, or maybe some quick questions about attitudes or beliefs. So where do we use surveys? Well, we use it a lot in academic research. Market research, yes. Every time you buy something online, you pretty much have to fill out a survey, or they're asking you to fill out a survey. We use surveys for polling in elections. They have exit surveys. Basically, after people leave the polling booth, they'll say, "Oh, who'd you vote for?" Right? Again, this is self-report, so it's very possible that people might be saying things that aren't true. We see employee satisfaction surveys, user experience surveys. We just see surveys everywhere. So it's the most commonly used research design. So in thinking about that, okay, we're getting a snapshot of people's attitudes and beliefs. There is definitely a cognitive process involved when it comes to surveys. So first of all, the person who's taking the survey has to interpret the question. So they need to read it and understand the concept or issue that's being asked about. So this puts the onus on the researcher to make sure the questions they write are very clear and easily understandable. Typically, researchers and survey developers are told to pitch the questions at a 5th grade level. Second part, information retrieval. Okay, so now that somebody's read the question and they understand it, second part is what kind of information in their memories do they need to draw upon to answer the question properly? So that's what we mean by information retrieval. Step 3, judgment formation. So now, okay, you've read the question, you know what kind of information you're getting. Now you've got to use your judgment to decide how to answer it, or among all the relevant pieces of information that's in your head right now, which one is most relevant to the question being asked? Fourth is response formatting. So this again depends on the type of survey. If it's multiple choice, then they need to select which choice, or if it's open-ended, to write out their response. And finally, response editing. Ensures correct response was selected or conveyed. Many people who answer surveys are not going to take the time to response edit unless it's going to be very impactful on them. But if it's just a random survey, they probably will not even go to step 5, but those who are very responsible will go to step 5. So again, 5 cognitive processes involved when it comes to taking a survey. Question interpretation, right? What are they asking? Information retrieval. What in my mind, what in my memories is relevant? Judgment formation, selecting from among those retrieved memories what is most appropriate to answer the question. Response formatting, either what choice you're going to circle or write out, a couple of sentences to answer the question. And then response editing to make sure that you answer it correctly. So what to ask? Well, what you ask on the survey should be driven by your research objective. What are you trying to do? Many times we might actually rely on an already established survey to find out what we want. And so if it's something, for example, about depression, there are numerous established measures like the Beck Depression Inventory. When you use an established measure, it kind of gives you a boost in terms of validity because it's established that it's fairly bias-free. You can use convergent validity to see how the results from your own sample compared to the results of others. There are a number of reasons why it would be a good idea to use an already established survey. So the researcher has to decide what they want to know and the research objective in order to determine what questions to ask. So kinds of questions. Well, we might ask somebody about their attitudes and beliefs. For example, I have used a survey that asks for people's sense of support from their family. There's another survey that can ask about self-esteem. So those kind of things could easily be asked in a survey. Facts and demographics, as I mentioned before, asking for somebody's age, ethnicity, gender identification. Those things are really easy to gather in a survey format. Behaviors. So attitudes and beliefs is something intangible, right? It's like, do you believe in God? Do you believe in global warming? Those kind of things. Behaviors, on the other hand, are specific, observable, and measurable. So in addition to attitudes and beliefs, it's also a really good idea to ask questions about specific behaviors that may convey these or express these attitudes and beliefs. For example, how many times did you recycle a plastic bag in the last 7 days? Or how many schools have you attended since graduating high schools? These kind of questions are really nice because they're very solid. So this would require somebody to retrieve the information from their memories. And there are ways also, so we have these attitudes, beliefs, facts and demographics, and behavior questions, but we need to think about how we are asking those questions. So there is an acronym known as BRUSO that researchers should abide by. So B stands for brief, that the surveys and the questions should not be too long. You don't want it to be too complicated. The longer the surveys are, the less likely that participants will actually complete the survey. So that's really important to know. R stands for relevant. Only questions that actually pertain to the research question should be asked. So you don't want to go wandering off on a tangent in terms of your survey. U stands for unambiguous. This means there should only be one way to interpret the questions. Okay, so when you read it, and I'll give you examples of not so great survey questions, you want to make sure that any participants who read the questions are interpreting it as consistently as possible. S is for specifics. You have brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, meaning that you should only ask about one topic at a time in your questions. And then the last one is objective. The questions should not reflect research or biases. You should avoid things called loaded words, and I'll give you examples of that one. So again, you want to think back to BRUSO, brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. Okay, how to ask, being unambiguous. Well, in order to be unambiguous, you want to make sure you're not using jargon or specialized language. Avoid slang because not everyone will understand the slang terms, and slang terms are very generational and also culturally specific. You also want to avoid abbreviations. We live in a world of alphabet soup, and what one acronym, to one group may not mean the same things to other people. So you want to avoid abbreviations. If you're going to use abbreviations, you want to make sure you spell out all the words first and then use the abbreviation, just for clarity. So for example, has your circadian rhythm changed with your developmental stage? Well, for psychology students who took developmental psychology, that's easily enough and interpreted enough, but other people might not know what a circadian rhythm is. And maybe they're like, what do you mean by developmental stage? What is that? Right? So you want to make sure you want it more simple. And that would be, have you noticed a change in your sleep patterns as you've gotten older? So this language is more easily understood by people, from different age groups and also from different backgrounds. Also important to avoid negative wording. So when you start using negatives, it can really confuse people. So for example, should schools not allow junk food in school cafeterias? What does that mean? Does that mean, are you saying, yeah, if you say yes, That means they should not allow junk food in school cafeterias. What if you say no? What if you say no, but you actually meant you don't like the idea of junk food in school cafeterias? So to avoid that confusion, just ask a straightforward, positively worded question. Should schools only offer healthy food in cafeterias? So this gets to the same idea about junk food and people's attitudes toward it, but it's a lot more direct. It's like, if you don't want junk food, then do you want healthy food, right? Right, so that's B for being unambiguous. Being specific, avoid double-barreled question. A double-barreled question is when you kind of include more than one component in a question. So for example, do you support homework and PE or physical education for children? So first of all, shouldn't have PE because people might not realize what PE stands for. And then there are two components. There's homework and then there's PE. So if somebody says yes, does that mean they are supporting homework? Does that mean they're supporting physical education? Does it mean both? What if you only support one? What are you supposed to answer? So this is what we mean by a double-barreled question, and that it's problematic. Better, more specific, is do you support 1 hour of homework for children in grades 5 through 8? And then ask another question. Do you support physical education for children in grades 5 to 8? So this is much more specific, gives you age groups, and gives you kind of more a defined sense of what it is they're asking. So homework. Well, I like the second question where it says 1 hour of homework, because 1 hour of homework is very different from 6 hours of homework or 20 minutes of homework, right? So it gives person reading it more background information to answer the question accurately. There's also the idea of simplicity versus specificity. So, for example, do you drink alcohol? Is a very simple question, but it can be interpreted in a number of ways. So we want to be more specific. How often do you drink more than a glass of wine in an hour? So that gives you enough context that you can get a sense, and it's better for the researcher because if somebody says, do you drink alcohol? And they say yes, what information can you actually really get from that? Not much. So you want to be specific enough that you can actually draw the information that you're trying to receive from your data. In terms of being objective, we want to avoid questions and terminology that might make people uncomfortable or feel like they're being judged. And that's what we mean by loaded questions. For example, do you think it is dangerous to allow preschoolers to play in the same yard as fourth graders? Well, the word dangerous is loaded because no one wants to feel like they're supporting something that could harm preschoolers. So a better way to put it would be, should preschool children play in the yard at the same time as children 2 to 3 years older than they are? Again, there's enough information in there that the researcher can get a sense of what it is that the person who's responding it feels, and then the person who's responding has a good sense of what's being asked of them and can envision the situation. Another problem is if the question is worded so far ahead in the future that it's kind of useless, right? Like that the respondent may not even know how to answer. So suppose a new vegan grocery store opened in your neighborhood. Would you shop there, right? How soon? How soon would this happen? How often, right? How often do you shop at your local grocery store? Do you prefer to have vegan options or something that would be much more defined and useful in terms of information? Other things to think about. You want to avoid what we call overlapping or unbalanced response categories. So for example, are you satisfied with your job or are there things you do not like about it? Well, the or makes it really hard for somebody to answer. What if there are things they don't like about it, but they still like their job, right? So you want to make sure that your questions are simple enough that it's only asking one topic at a time, and that makes it easy for interpretation of answers as well as interpretation for the person reading the question. So you might do something like this. How much do you agree with this statement? I feel satisfied with my job. And then make it a Likert scale. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Another consideration is you want to avoid what they call yay saying or nay saying. If you have a bunch of questions that are similarly worded, then people might just mark off the same answer. And we call that a response set. And pretty much when researchers see that, it makes our heart sink because it means that people got bored and stopped reading the questions. Okay, responses. This is self-report. So as a researcher, we are to assume that the people who are answering the questions are being truthful and accurate. We also want to consider that there might be some potential problems, that response set that I mentioned. Social desirability happens when the person answering the questions are concerned that somehow it might be traced back to them, and they don't want people to think badly of them. And so instead of answering truthfully, they answer in a way that they believe will make them look good to other people. That's social desirability. Demand characteristics are when the participant wants to help the researcher, they think they know what the hypothesis is, and they answer in a way that they think will help the researcher. What they don't realize is that anything that makes people who are responding deviate from the truth, from their authentic feelings, that actually damages the study, right? So whenever you have to fill out a survey, please be honest. Also, two types of questions are close-ended. So those are like multiple choice questions where the answer's there, choose one. And there are open-ended, which you can imagine more like short answer, where it gives you a question, and then you can write as little or as much as you want to. So for close-ended questions, as I mentioned, that's kind of like multiple choice, where the person who is responding has some limited alternatives. Rating scales also considered close-ended, that strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree. That's considered close-ended. Anything where a choice has to be made in that sense is a close-ended question. It's harder for a researcher to write well-worded, close-ended questions. Also, what's nice about it is it gives you, again, it can gather a lot of data in a short period of time, so it's very quantitative. So for close-ended questions, more effort is needed in developing the questions, but once you collect the answers, it's so easy to analyze. On the other hand, with open-ended questions, the people answering the survey can respond in any way, literally open, great for exploratory situations, for description, learning more about how people think and feel. For example, what motivates you to work hard in school? Very open-ended question, right? So these are easier to write. This type is qualitative, right? So whereas close-ended questions are quantitative because it's easily captured and analyzed, open-ended questions are qualitative, so that will require inter-rater reliability. It will require a code book so that people can correctly interpret what people are writing down. So easier to write, much more difficult to analyze than close-ended questions. You will need a transcription of everything that they responded, and then you also need a coding manual. Okay, rating scales. So this is definitely another type. As I mentioned, you have the close-ended. So a rating scale could be a strongly disagree through strongly agree type of rating scale. You could also do something like this. So this is a Likert scale, and it goes up to 7. So this is the most I've ever seen. Sometimes Likert scales go up to 4 or 5. And usually those are close-ended rating scales that have to do with attitudes. So I feel confident in my abilities as a student. Not at all representative is 1, and all the way to strongly representative is 7. So this can give researchers kind of a sense with all these choices. It's really interesting to see where respondents fall. So sometimes they'll do a lot of threes, sometimes they'll do some sixes. It's hard to say. If you don't give them a wide range, then less for them to choose, less for them also to determine what is most accurate. What if they don't feel like anything is truly accurate and captures their feelings? So in addition to wording the surveys and everything, we want to look at the types of questions and how to format it. So in the introduction of a survey, you want to make sure that you indicate how important it is to complete the survey. You would have to establish informed consent and really hope that they complete the survey all the way. So you don't want the survey so long that they get bored or tired, they've run out of time, and they don't complete the whole thing. Your instructions need to be very clear. It might give examples on how to use response scales, and also consider the order in which you're asking questions. So there's something called item order effect, where you want to put more sensitive questions probably toward the back, because those sensitive questions could impact how they answer other questions. Also, you might want to group items in terms of theme so that it's easier for people to understand. Remember, the whole idea is you want to reduce what we call cognitive load. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to answer the questions. So with grouping of items, if you do it by topic, it's one way of establishing construct validity. You might do it by the types of questions. So maybe you might have all the rating scale types together, the short response types together, different ways you can do it. And we do recommend that you put demographic questions last. And that's because it could be that even answering gender identification or racial or ethnic group has the participants thinking about that the rest of the time, and that could impact the way they're answering some of the questions. So as much as possible, you want people to respond in a way that's authentic, that isn't in any way leading them to one answer or another. You want them to answer as honestly as possible. Okay, so how do we administer surveys? Well, you could do face-to-face interviews. That has it's really good in terms of completion, because very few people are going to get into a conversation with a researcher and walk away before the survey is done. So in terms of that, face-to-face interviews are really good. It is the gold standard. You get a high response rate for those who stop and actually answer the questions. It gives the person who's doing the survey an opportunity to develop personal rapport with the participant. But the problem is there could be interview effects. In other words, perhaps because it's a face-to-face interview, that people might not answer uncomfortable questions honestly, because they're actually looking at a live person in front of them, right? So that could impact the validity of the responses that they're giving. So interview effects, that just having an interviewer there may influence the participant's response. It's also quite expensive to do face-to-face interviews, because you have to pay the people who are doing the surveys. So it's a very expensive way to do surveys, but it has the highest response rate of all. Telephone interviews, response rate for telephone interviews is about 40%, so not great. Some problems. Well, people might be distracted when it's a phone interview. Usually people are doing something else, and so they may not be focusing completely on the questions being asked. It's also more mentally taxing because, again, remember that whole idea of question interpretation is in there. And, if English is not their first language, then that could become a little problematic. Again, you may still have interviewer effects similar to the face-to-face interviews. And there's also cell phone effects, meaning people who have cell phones or certain area codes, there could be underlying systematic differences in those who don't live in those area codes, or maybe those who don't have cell phones. What we hardly ever see now are mail surveys. That has a really low response rate of like 15%. You save money in the sense that you're not hiring people to go give the surveys, but it's not environmentally friendly, right? You're killing trees. high supply cost, low response rate. A lot of people will not even complete it. So mail surveys are not an effective way to conduct surveys. And then online surveys are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, right? Why? Well, it's cheap. It's really cheap. Reduce labor and production costs. You can access special groups of people who might like not go out in real person to a mall or something like that, but who love to do the online shopping. Well, you can reach them. What's not great is lack of representation, meaning that those who do respond to online surveys, this is a self-selected group, and it's not necessarily representative of the entire population. So these are some, issues that you need to consider in terms of administering the surveys. Okay, so again, when we talk about the questions, it's Brusso, right? You need to think about what is your research objective? You're trying to describe, explain, predict, control. What's the question asking? So in terms of deciding on the questions, you need to consider, just like every other research design, the different types of validity. So face validity, does it seem on the surface that the questions pertain to the construct of interest? Construct validity, right? We want to make sure that you have the different dimensions of it. And the content validity is what are the different components, the aspects. Do we have it all in terms of like intelligence, for example? So we want to make sure, remember that construct validity also includes criterion validity in terms of making sure that the results are converging with previous studies as well. Again, you have the different types of questions. You can ask about attitudes and beliefs, facts and demographics, and behaviors. Here again is Brusso: brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. So in terms of response considerations, we want to make sure that we encourage truth and accuracy from the participants. We are conscious about the order in which the questions are asked. We need to, as researchers, consider reducing response sets, reducing the idea of social desirability, so you don't put loaded words so people don't feel like they're being judged by the answer, and consider the demand characteristics as well. You want to make sure that you have good content validity, and you want to make sure that your sample is as broad and diverse as possible so that you have an increase of external validity. So who to ask? When we do studies, you will hear us talk about samples, because a population is all the cases or observations of interest to us, and it is impossible to get 100% of your population. So we always get a subset of that, and that's our sample. Again, you want to make sure that your sample is as diverse as possible, and that is important for external validity. Two types of sampling methods, that's probability sampling and non-probability sampling. So some terminology. Sampling frame is actually your operational definition of your population. So let's say you're interested in kids in early childhood. Well, you have to come up with an operational population. So maybe it might be preschoolers in this certain preschool. So the sampling frame is the actual population from which your sample is being drawn. And we need to consider, right, is this sample representative? Meaning it includes as many people as possible that represent the diversity of the population you have? Or is it a biased or non-representative sample? And sometimes it might end up biased just because we don't have much choice in terms of who's responding to our study. So most surveys, it's pretty hard to get a completely unbiased sample, a truly representative sample. But remember that as with this recognition, we have a decrease in external validity. So you want to do as much as you can to address any kind of bias or systematic differences among people who you're interviewing or surveying. When we talk about probability sampling, What we mean is that every single member of the population you're interested in is specific and known. So you know how many people exactly are in the population of interest so that you know the probability of those people being selected. So probability sampling is actually guided by statistical theory in terms of sample selection. Here are a few types of probability sampling. First, simple random sampling, meaning every member has an equal chance of selection. So we said our population of interest is Evergreen Valley College, then you would take all of the names of the registered students there, put them in a hat, and select names from that. That's simple random sampling. Doesn't happen a lot. Now, let's say even with simple random sampling, you're like, well, my research question actually needed to make sure that we're going to compare maybe male identified, female identified, and non-binary. So if that's a situation, then you want to try stratified random sampling, because in this way, you're making sure that you have the right proportions from each of these groups. So in stratified random sampling, your sampling frame is divided into subgroups. So as I mentioned in the example, male identified, female identified, non-binary. You divide them based on their identification, and then you make sure maybe if your sample size was 90, that you got 30 from each group. All right, so example, allocating 50% of spaces in a sample to females only. This ensures equal representation of males and females. So cluster sampling, you use that when you don't have a ready-made sampling frame for your population of interest, but you do have our groups of people. So in a cluster sampling, you're using units that contain members of the population of interest. So what you do here is you randomly select the clusters. So everybody in a specific school, for example, let's say you want to look at school-age children. What you might do is list all the schools in a certain geographical area, and then you would randomly choose one of the schools and then interview or survey everybody in that school. So that's how that cluster sampling happens. All participants in the randomly selected clusters are selected to participate in the survey. Then you have multi-stage sampling, where you have other stages of sampling before randomly selecting participants. So different ways of collecting your data, right? So here's a clustering sample example. You have a lot of elementary schools listed here. And then what you do for cluster sampling is randomly maybe put the names of all these elementary schools in a hat and then randomly sample 2 or 3 of them. And then you would conduct a survey on everybody in that school. So that's what we mean by cluster sampling. So for probability sampling, right, you have 3 types. You have simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and then you have cluster sampling. Now let's talk about non-probability methods. So with non-probability methods, we do not know the probability of people being selected. So an example is if you're trying to do an online survey, you're going to have to do non-probability sampling because you have no idea how many people are going to see the link and take it. So non-probability sampling is less costly, easier to obtain. It is a threat to external validity because you don't have true random sampling involved there. So some ways that we do non-probability sampling. One is called convenience sampling, also known as haphazard. And this is really just you collect a sample from people where it's easiest for you to get them. So for example, Psych 1 students, there's an example of convenience sampling for you. What is the bias? Well, bias, remember, happens when the sample you're drawing from doesn't reflect the population. So that example I gave you of Psych 1 students, college students are not actually very representative of the population of the entire United States. Think about that. You know, you don't have a majority of people in this country with a college degree. And so to use college students for the sample size you might think, oh man, how is this going to have external validity when these people are not similar to everybody else? Well, you know what? Somehow we can still do it. Somehow we still get reasonable results that can apply to other people. It is the most common type of sampling, not expensive, faster, easier to obtain because it is at the convenience of the researcher. So what we found is that even if it can't be totally generalized, we do still find some truth, elements of truth in the results, and so they still are meaningful. And it's funny because some non-probability samples are more representative than others. So with the convenience sampling, it could be that even if you did it through convenience, that you get a fairly diverse sample. Another way we sample is called quota sampling. So this is very similar to the stratified sampling that we talked about in the probability sampling method. So with quota sampling, again, you select a sample to reflect the subgroups in your population, very similar to stratified random sampling. The difference is that here the sample is not randomly selected. So you have, your group of 500 students, and you're going to say, okay, those of you who identify as male, we're going to get, 50 of you. Those of you who identify as female, so very similar, we're going to get 50 of you as well. It's very similar to the stratified random sampling where you're going to put them into subgroups and then make sure you have a certain number from each or certain proportion from each subgroup. Purposive sampling, that happens when you have very specific criteria. You don't want just anybody answering your survey. So it could be, what if it's a survey about car preferences? Then maybe in purposive sampling, you're going to choose people who are in the car sales business, and that way you get insight from them. So with this expert sampling, researchers identify experts on a topic and ask them to participate. So that's purposive sampling. You're not just randomly selecting people. You have a certain group of people who you really want to learn from. Snowball sampling happens when you have maybe a group who's really hard to reach. And so you're relying on people who participate in the study to go out and get more participants from the study. So an example of snowball sampling might be used if you want to study homeless, for example, where it's not that easy to get them. Maybe you'll start off with 2 or 3 homeless people, or sorry, unhoused people, and then ask them to reach out to, 2 friends each so that you can get a larger sample. And then you just keep asking them to do that. And of course, compensation is involved. The problem with purposive sampling is it probably doesn't have great external validity. Self-selection sampling is also extremely convenient. In this case, you're just letting people pick whoever wants to take the survey, go for it, right? So individuals choose to take part in the survey of their own accord without being approached by the researcher directly. So online surveys pretty much are going to be that way, where it's like, oh, I'm doing a study on self-esteem. Would you like to be part of the study? And then they send it out. So that's self-selection sampling. So before magazines, or maybe you might see postings on bulletin boards to participate in studies, and contact the researcher if you're interested. The idea though is that if the hypothesis is accurate and well worded, it could be that even with a convenient sample or self-selection sampling, you could still have fairly significant results. And I mentioned that the importance of replication is there because it's when other people can do the similar study and expand on it, then you start to build the validity of your results. So in terms of evaluating your samples, again, you want to try to get a sample as representative of the population as possible. Surveys are quantitative, so you want to get as many data points as possible. You want to get, if you can, a random sample from all individuals in the population. You want to make sure that those participants are answering all the questions in your survey. One type of bias we need to be mindful about is that a researcher might choose a group that's not representative of the general population. So let's say a researcher is interested in beliefs about toothbrushing, right? Then you want to actually go out and recruit many different people. If you only ask people who are sitting in a dentist's office, that could very well have sampling bias, right? Like maybe they all have toothaches because they haven't been brushing their teeth. Who knows? But the idea is you need to be wary as a researcher that when you're not doing random sampling, it could potentially impact the general external validity of your study. Another component to think about it's called the response rate, is what percentage of people are actually completing the entire survey. This is important because it seems that those who do not complete surveys are quite different from those who will complete it all the way. So there's something called the non-response bias, that it's very possible that people who start a survey and don't finish it have something systematic going on with them. Why aren't they finishing the survey, right? The lower your response rate, the more likely it is that bias will affect your findings, the more it's going to impact your external validity. So again, why would we use surveys? We can use it to describe characteristics of a population. The census is a survey. We might also be able to use it to compare characteristics of people with different things in common, different populations or subgroups. Surveys are great for helping us find time trends, right? We can gather a lot of data and develop charts and do all sorts of graphs with them. We can use surveys to get relations among variables. So we can often use survey responses to help us with correlations. Surveys are great for testing hypotheses, theories, and models. It is very quantitative. What's a limitation? Well, we cannot establish cause and effect with a survey. If we use poor sampling techniques, that could really impact our external validity. We rely on self-report. So again, we're making the assumption that people are being honest and truthful when they answer questions. In terms of validity, what are we doing in terms of surveys? Well, for face validity, we need to ask, do the questions appear to address the psychological construct of interest? So at first glance, do these questions make sense? For construct validity, we want to know, does the survey actually assess this construct that we're interested in? Does this survey actually assess self-esteem? So with content validity, we want to know if all aspects of the construct are included. With criterion validity, this is especially relevant if we're trying to develop our own survey, right? So convergent validity, do the results correlate positively with results from other related constructs? With discriminant, we are looking for negative or low correlations. Do the results negatively correlate with the results from other theoretically unrelated constructs? Concurrent validity. Now we're talking about getting results from other surveys, other times, not necessarily the same time. Do the results of the new measure correlate with the results of an established measure of the same construct taken at the same time? So that's concurrent. And then we have predictive validity. Do the results consistently help to anticipate a future outcome? So all of those pertain to construct validity. Then we have statistical validity. Is the analysis conducted appropriate? Remember, the more data points, the better. The type of data you're collecting, closed-ended versus open-ended, that's going to impact statistical validity. And then we have external validity. Will the results be applicable to other populations and contexts? Generally, surveys have better external validity than experiments, and the experiments have better internal validity as compared to surveys. All right, so a summary of our survey research. Well, we use surveys for self-report helps us to understand people's attitudes and beliefs. It's a great way to collect vast amounts of data. That's why you see surveys all the time. It's a good complement to other research designs because you could ask, participants questions about demographic group, maybe schools they went to, countries they visited, all sorts of things. You can actually use it in connection with other research designs. You want to be mindful that when you write survey questions, you want to use those Brusso principles: brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. You also want to be mindful of the ways you're going to administer a survey. So face-to-face has the greatest response rate, but it's very expensive. Telephone and mail are not used very much anymore, and they have low response rates. And then you have online, and it's potentially a self-selected sample when you do online, but it's also very convenient and fast. Make sure you know the difference between the probability and non-probability sampling methods, right? So probability, you have the simple, random, stratified random, and cluster. With non-probability, you have convenience, quota, purposive, self-selection, and self-selection sampling methods. Also keep in mind that as cheap and great it is to get survey data, there are limitations. All right, you can't establish causality. You are relying on people's self-report, and if you're not sampling properly, then it might impact your external validity. And finally, you want to think about that survey designs. So think about the validities: base, construct, content, criterion, convergent, concurrent, predictive, statistical, external. All of these components, kind of play a role in how valid your conclusions are with the survey. So I will stop here. Thank you so much for joining me. And I hope to see you in class again next week. Bye-bye.